Good evening. My name is Poppy. I'm dyspraxic and I've come to talk to you this week about my experiences in climbing and mountaineering. Just before I get started, I wanted to say that there is some discussion of disordered eating, so if you'll find that difficult, this might be one to give a miss. And I also wanted to start by talking a little bit about the term disabled or referring to dyspraxia as a disability. Personally, I do identify myself as disabled, but I know that not everybody in the community does. I do recognize that there's a difference between a learning disability and a specific learning difficulty, and that I don't have a learning disability. But because of the kind of wide range of disabling effects that dyspraxia has on me, I'm going to refer to myself as disabled and talk a lot about the disabled community during my presentation. So I wanted to start by introducing myself. My name is Poppy. I was diagnosed with dyspraxia when I was a student. So I'd started to suspect as a teenager that some of the difficulties I had might be related to dyspraxia. But when I spoke to the school nurses, they said, well, there's nothing on your medical record to suggest that, so we're not going to pursue it. So I had to wait until I was really struggling in my first year of sort of practicals at university. And then I accessed the university's disability and dyslexia service to kind of provide me with the support I needed to get a diagnosis. I suppose that will probably be familiar to a lot of people. I was studying occupational therapy at the time, which I really enjoyed, and I'm now working as a children's occupational therapist. So I graduated in 2017 and I did a few years of rotations in an adult hospital and then a children's hospital. And now I work in a children's intensive care unit looking after people who've had brain injuries or are born with various problems. I've had 6 trips to hospital with concussions. I always think that this is a sort of dyspraxic fun fact that makes a nice icebreaker when you're meeting dyspraxic adults. I'm also a communications rep with Paraclimbing London, and I'm a trustee at UK Paraclimbing Collective. So these are 2 organisations, one based in London and one a bit more UK wide, that work towards encouraging more people with different disabilities to get involved in climbing. So today I wanted to tell you a bit about my journey with movement in general, and then how I came to climbing and why I think that climbing is such a great thing for people like us to try. And then I want to talk a bit about what you can do if you want to get more involved in climbing or just in movement generally. I really wish that I was able to present this in person, but because it's a pre-recording, if you do want to ask any questions, please do get in touch with me and I'll provide my details at the end. Nice to meet you all. So my early experiences in sport, I think were probably quite typical for someone with dyspraxia. And I bet that I'm not the only person here who's ever been chosen last for a team in PE. That sort of experience where the 2 team captains have been chosen and you're standing on the playground and they're picking one by one who to have on their team, and you know that you're going to be last, and it's an excruciating 5 minutes that you go through maybe twice a week for 10 years. Being publicly mocked by a PE teacher, I think, is a fairly common experience. Something my dad once said to my brother who's autistic is that if you had children who had problems with maths, they would be in a special set for people who had problems with maths, and they would get appropriate tuition to their needs. And you would never dream of bringing them up to the front of the mainstream class and having them write maths on the board and then laughing at them when they get it wrong. But actually, teachers in PE seem to have a sort of license to do this. I know that was the case about 10 years ago, and I think it probably is now. So I think that's an influence on why lots of us have a difficult relationship with movement. And lastly, have you ever been injured in a school PE lesson? I think maybe the less said about that, the better. And here's little me not being able to hula hoop. So when I was about 7, my parents decided to take me to a martial arts class. I think that this was a more positive experience of movement, and I'm hoping that other dyspraxic people have had a go at martial arts as well. She wanted me to improve my balance and my coordination, which I think I did a little bit, but it was a slow process. What was nice about this, in contrast to the things I'd done physically before, were that it's not competitive at all. And it's not really a team sport, so it's not as though you've got other people that you're worried about letting down. All abilities can train together, so that meant that if my brother had been better at it than me, or vice versa, we'd still be able to go together. My parents, as adults, were still able to train with the children, And it's sort of the case that you're standing up for as much as you're able to do. And then when it gets to something too difficult, then you sit down. So you get to have a go at all the things that you can do. You get to watch the rest of it. And they don't ever tell you who you can and can't work with in partner work and things like that. So you can work with anybody else in the class, which is really nice. I think the downsides are still that even if there's no obvious competitive component, other children will still compare to each other. And so I still did get a little bit of bullying for not being able to pick things up as fast or for falling over a lot. And there is grading in martial arts, so I don't think it's compulsory, but you do want to join in with your family and your friends. And having to memorize patterns and things like that was quite difficult and did create a bit of anxiety. But generally, this was a better experience. Then, as a teenager, I started to get into running. And I've changed my focus a little bit here to ask the question, what is movement about? Why do we do it? What is it for? And what should we look for in a positive movement experience? So I started running partly to improve my fitness, but quite a lot of it was because I wanted to do something with my dad, who was very into running. And it was quite a sort of nice way to connect with my family. So at the time, I had a cousin who was a triathlete and his dad was coaching him. And so his dad and my dad had lots of conversations about the best way to improve at running. My grandpa was really invested in how I was doing, and then it was a nice way to connect with the family. But also, generally speaking, it's more about individual progress. So again, you're not working with a team to try and beat other teams. You're just trying to see how you can challenge yourself, how you can see improvements in your own running times, in your fitness, in the way that you feel. And I enjoyed that individual aspect. The thing that did eventually become difficult was that I was maybe 14, I think, when I started, and lots of the things that I was hearing around school and seeing in the media, and lots of the sort of social pressures, even coming from in-school PSHE and things like that, led me to focus a lot on my weight and what I looked like, and a sort of distorted idea, I suppose, of how healthy I was. And so then running became a little bit more about weight loss, trying to make myself thinner. And sometimes even as a punishment for if I'd eaten too much on a previous day or if I hadn't done enough on a previous day. So it got to a point where I was running 3 times a week before I started, well, no, sorry, 3 times a day before I started to be treated for those difficulties. And so that meant that by the time I got to 18 and I was moving out and becoming independent, I did have quite a difficult relationship with movement. So I'm coming back to that question, what is movement about? Now, by the time I was 18 and moving out to become independent at university, movement to me was a lot about being thinner. It was a lot about punishment. Certainly in my halls, it was sort of something that you had to do to fit in, like people would be judging you if you weren't exercising or working out or training in something. But equally, I think a lot of people considered it, something that they didn't want to do. It could be a bit of a chore, it could be something that you enjoyed, but you still had to do it. And so, because of all of these kind of competing factors, I ended up just really disengaged from exercise. I felt guilty that I wasn't doing it. I felt that I should be, but I just didn't feel able to do any kind of movement for a little while. But then, a few months into my first term at university, one of the boys on my OT course mentioned climbing, and he'd joined the university climbing club. I knew that the uni had a climbing wall and I'd sort of fancied it, but I thought it's all going to be boys and they're all going to be stronger than me. And, I'm just going to fall behind. But he really reassured me, no, it's a friendly environment. We're there to hang out and everybody's got different ability levels. And I thought, well, I'm not convinced, but I'm going to give it a try. So I come into the climbing club. It's not sort of a competitive environment. I found that because you're learning rope work at your first session at a rope wall, the first things that you have to do are sort of one-on-one teaching with somebody, so you're not immediately introduced to a big group. And then you can start really at the beginner end with easy things. A lot of the climbing club for me was about the social element, and I think that that applied to lots of people. So lots of people in the club would come down and chat with their friends and catch up, and they would get a few climbs in, but it would be more about hanging out with each other than it would about doing something really physically challenging. And that created a really relaxed atmosphere. What you can also see in the background of the picture is that we had what we call a feature wall. So the wall is always like that. It's not like the ones where there's plastic holes and different colors that you can stick on and make more challenging problems. The problems were always the same, and although I think they were graded sometime in the past, written in a notebook, stashed in a cupboard in 1970, I didn't know what the grades were. So it was much more about finding something fun and exciting and challenging to do than it was about trying to prove that you're improving your physical performance. And I think that created a really nice environment for me. So quite quickly, climbing became a sport that I could stick with. I could enjoy moving my body. I could enjoy seeing people, but I didn't feel inadequate and I didn't feel loads of pressures to be always working harder and harder. And that was fantastic for me. So my climbing has taken me in a few directions, I suppose. I started off with indoor climbing, and that's just another picture of a different angle of my university climbing wall. Quite old-fashioned it is. And then I moved into sport climbing. So that's a form of climbing outdoors where you have a cliff face and it's got lots of metal bolts in it. And so you clip your rope to metal bolts as you climb past them to keep yourself safe, and you climb up that way. From there, I moved on to trad climbing or traditional climbing. And this is sort of how people started outdoor climbing big faces. And rather than there being bolts already in the wall for you to clip to, there's nothing set in stone, and you take lots of different bits of metal kind of tools with you, and you put them into different cracks in the rock. You put them in different places where you think they'll be secure. You can attach slings to spikes, all kinds of different things. So you put your own protection in to keep you safe as you climb up. And then you bring somebody up after you and they take all of the equipment out because you've got them on a rope from above by that point. So aside from the real technicalities, I enjoy trad climbing because the focus isn't just on your physical performance. There's lots of sorts of puzzles and problem solving. You're thinking, well, how can I protect myself here? And how could I build an anchor here? And how am I going to split this really big face into different sections where we can break in the middle and recoil our rope and all of these things? It's more of a day out. It's more of an adventure. So I really resonated with that. Something else that I've tried is ice climbing. Now, I don't do very much of that because there's not really anywhere in the UK that has solid enough ice to climb. There's sort of some bits of Scotland where maybe in the winter, but it's not very safe because it's not really cold enough. So this picture here is from somewhere in Norway. Ice climbing is really physical, so that involves having crampons, big spikes that you've stuck to your boots, and then big axes like you would see in kind of climbing movies. And so you whack your axe into the ice, pull yourself up on that, stick your feet in, and keep going that way. The protection in ice climbing is quite similar to trad climbing, except that obviously because it's frozen, you can't just slide things into cracks in the rock. So you take big metal screws and you screw them into the ice and you clip yourself to that. But it is really tiring. So that's something that I found really exciting, but really exhausted. And then combining sort of all of those skills, I suppose, I got a bit more into alpine mountaineering. And in those situations, you kind of tie everything together. There are bits where you'd want access, particularly for walking, so you can see in that picture that I've got one in my hand, and that helps you to keep yourself steady and balanced when you're walking on snow and ice. And there's lots of aspects of the rope work that are very similar to traditional climbing. You might be protecting yourself by wrapping the rope around rocks as you walk, and you're protecting your friends as you go as well. There's also lots and lots of walking and lots of communication. So you'd always go mountaineering in a group. And the biggest predictive factor, I suppose, of if you'll stay safe and if you have a good time, is how well you can communicate. So really, I would say that I still engage in all of these different forms of climbing, but I suppose that's the way that I went through them. So I want to talk a little bit about why I think climbing suits dyspraxic people. So I suppose this will be a little bit more the kind of occupational therapy part where I'm thinking about, well, why is it that after so many bad experiences in sport, this is the one thing that I've been able to stick with and that I often recommend to other dyspraxic people? So the first reason is that you're only moving yourself in relation to a static environment. So when I think about why sport was so difficult at school, it's very often team sports. So you don't just have to be aware of your own position in space, which is difficult for us already, but also all the different people moving around you on an opposing team and on your team. And in order to kind of do anything involving those other people, you have to be constantly processing not just how your position in space is moving, but how everything around you is moving. And lots of us just can't do that fast enough. It becomes even more complex when you add other things like balls and sticks and equipment that you need to keep track of. So that can be really difficult. In climbing, it can be complicated to work out how to get where you want to go on the wall, but the wall isn't changing. So you only have to look at the wall and think, okay, where do I want to go next? And find a way to move yourself to there. It's predictable and it's safe in that regard. So I think that works really well for us. I also like that you can work with other people, and you very often are working with other people, but the social element is predictable. So I think I wouldn't want to say that lots of dyspraxic people are kind of socially anxious or antisocial, but for me, I can find it really difficult to kind of interact with people in an environment where I don't know what to expect or I have to make small talk. Whereas in climbing, you're very often working with somebody else, but especially in ropes climbing, most of the time one of you is on the wall and one of you is belaying. So during those times, you don't have to be talking, you just have to communicate using some climbing calls that you've already agreed to keep each other safe. And then when you come down, you've got the wall to talk about, you've got the climb to talk about, so you don't have to sit around thinking, am I going to ask about the weather, or have they got a new haircut? Have I got a holiday I can talk about? There's something that you can discuss that's common ground that's there for you. And I really enjoy that. Following on from that point, similar to martial arts in a way, you can climb with people who climb at different levels to you. Again, the belaying is the most important thing. So if you've got a really good friend who climbs at a completely different grade, they're still the ideal person for you to climb with because you will trust them for belaying. And if you start climbing with somebody, but they make progress at a different rate to you, that's okay. You can still climb together. I think one of the things that I personally have found really frustrating in sport and movement generally is that I could join a class as a beginner, and then all the people I joined with would progress faster than me. And then a new lot of beginners would come and I'd be training with them, and then they'd overtake me and move on as well. And that can be really frustrating and demoralizing. But even if you've got sort of the frustration tolerance to manage that, in a practical sense, with something like running or swimming or cycling, if somebody else can go further or if somebody else can go faster than you, actually you're limited in what you can continue to do together. Whereas in climbing, it doesn't matter how fast you progress, you can keep on working as a couple. And at most indoor climbing walls and at most outdoor crags, so the rock faces that you climb on, they're aligned of different difficulty near to each other. So you can always go out for a trip with the person that you want to climb with. And that's really nice. I also think that you can build strength and coordination through climbing, but it's in sort of a fun way rather than sitting down at a gym or with a pull-up bar and thinking, right, I've got to get stronger. It can be a challenge in climbing that there's lots of upper body strength required, but actually you can compensate with that with technique to a certain level. And once you've been climbing for a long time, what I found was that without deliberately trying to train my strength, I did get a little bit stronger and I did get a little bit more aware of my body and my position in space. And that's been really helpful in other areas of my life, like for carrying heavy shopping and for driving and for the kind of complicated motor tasks that I need to do at work. I think that low muscle tone is maybe an under-acknowledged problem that dyspraxic adults can have. I know that in occupational therapy, we talk a lot about low muscle tone in relation to dyspraxic children. You know, they might slide out of their seats, they might be floppy, but most of dyspraxia research really is concerned with children, and there's not very much to say or to investigate how difficult it can be for us to build and maintain muscle mass as adults. But actually, that makes a real difference to your sports performance. So I suppose that's something I reflect on. Climbing is also really good for people who've got hypermobility or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Personally, I've got really stiff joints. They're very stable. I don't have that problem, but I know that there's a link between hypermobility and dyspraxic people. Um, and I wanted to say that this is a sport that most people who've got hypermobility or Ehlers-Danlos can access. A lot of the reason for this is that particularly with top rope climbing, you can eliminate the risk of falling and hitting the ground. And climbing itself is actually quite a low impact activity. So you are putting weight through your joints, but you can distribute the weight through all four of your limbs. So you're not putting all of it on one at any time, really. And you can sort of decide how comfortable you are with doing a particular move. And if you start to do something and you find it really hurts, you can immediately stop. You're weighting the rope, you're not weighting any of your limbs. And so it's a really nice way to gradually build up the amount of stress that you're putting on your joints. Also, because you gradually train all four limbs, quite a lot of people find that they can build strength in the muscles and ligaments that stabilize joints. And so some hypermobile people might find that through climbing for a long time, they can start to bring down their risk of dislocations and the kind of aches and pains that they experience day to day. And that is relevant to lots of dyspraxic people, although not necessarily me. Aside from that sciencey bit, I did want to explain why I loved climbing. It's all very well me saying, oh, well, you can do this, but just because I can doesn't mean that I should. So why do I think climbing is great? It's not going to be a hard sell. If it's not something that appeals to you, that's fine. And I will explore at the end more general kind of principles of movement and what it should be about. But I do want to talk about what I enjoy in climbing as well. So I really like traveling. And when I'm climbing, I get to visit incredible places throughout the UK and other parts of the world as well. You can always travel, anyway without having a particular focus, but I think it can be really difficult to plan, well, what do I want to do and where do I want to go and why? And through climbing, you can find a place that's got the particular adventure that you want to have. And for me, sometimes it's climbing, sometimes it's swimming, sometimes it's hiking. But then once you're in that place, you also get to try the food in the area potentially, and you get to meet some people who live there, and you get to see a different kind of architecture to what you might at home. And as you can see in this picture, you do also get to see lots of incredible views. And I really like that. I find I'm always scrimping together my annual leave to spend as long as I can visiting different amazing places. And lots of that is within the UK as well. I find I'm often really grateful for the things that my body and my mind can do. And really, you can get that from any sport, but there are certain aspects of climbing that have been really challenging because of my dyspraxia. In this case, I'm thinking more about rope work. So this picture is taken on a sort of multi-pitch trad route. So I've had to put lots of equipment in and build an anchor. And then once I'm tied to that anchor, then I can bring somebody else up and keep them safe while they're climbing. So these things are really cool, but they're quite safety critical. And it did take me a long time to learn how to tie the right knots and equalize the anchor. And at first, that was really frustrating. I had to resit some of the lessons at uni. But actually, even now, sort of 7 years later, I still find myself really excited every time I do those things. And that could be, 100 times in a year or more. Every time I build an anchor and I safely bring my friends up, I'm thinking, wow, like it's so amazing that my brain and my hands and my mind and my body all work together to make this really complicated thing happen that benefits not just me, but other people that are on my adventure as well. And I think that actually most people who pick up these skills naturally don't necessarily take the time to be mindful about it. Whereas if you've had to really struggle to learn those things and you do every time think, wow, this is amazing. I'm so grateful that I've got this opportunity and that my mind and my hands are doing the things that I want them to do. I also think, coming back to some points I made earlier, I suppose, that the relationships that you build in climbing can be really meaningful and really long-term relationships. So, like I was saying, if you're somebody that finds the kind of initial bit of forming a friendship really awkward, in climbing, those things sort of happen naturally because there's a structure for how you communicate with each other, you've got something to talk about. And as you progress in climbing, you find yourself doing more things that involve a little bit of risk. You go through some more intense experiences. So, probably with your climbing friends, you would have sometimes when you're feeling frightened and they reassure you, and you'd have sometimes where you're working together towards something that's really challenging and you're getting frustrated, but then you achieve it and you all feel amazing. And you have sometimes where you think you're not going to be able to do something, but somebody else helps you find a way to do it. And all of these kind of really intense experiences do bring you closer together. You're really putting your life in somebody's hands. And I think that's almost a shortcut to friendships that you really care about and really value. And I think now the only people I really see from my university are my climbing friends, but I still do, almost every weekend, even though I don't live locally to them. And I think that it is really valuable to have those kinds of relationship. Climbing has led me to great lifestyle changes. And when I went to think about what I was going to say after I put the slides together, I thought, oh no, because actually lifestyle changes has almost become a euphemism for a diet these days. But that's not what I mean at all. I think what I meant is when I was sort of 19, 18, thinking about what I was going to do and having moved to university, everybody's planning for how they're going to have a really star-studded career and how they're going to save their money up and how they're going to get on the property ladder, and how they're going to move to a nice area and then have some children who go to a lovely posh school. And those are sort of the aims that people are working towards in life. And I think once I'd been climbing, I almost immediately went into my overdraft, which I've been really scrupulously trying not to do at university. But I did it so that I could go on my first climbing trip. And once I'd done that, I suppose I started to prioritize a little bit differently. So now I do have quite an interesting career, I think, but it's not the number one focus of my life. And every week, pretty much, I'm looking at the weekend and thinking, where am I going to go? What adventure am I going to go on? And these days, I find that I prioritize spending time with the people that I care about almost more than anything else. I'm planning an adventure, but I don't want to go on one on my own. It's how can I go and get to this place with my paraclimbing friends, or how can I go and have this swimming holiday I wanted to with my parents? And I think that the way I prioritize has been really different. I also bought a camper van, which isn't something I ever expected to spend money on, but I didn't spend very much money on it, to be fair. Um, and then I was able to take a year out of work, which I really probably wouldn't have thought to do if I hadn't been spending all my time going climbing. And I spent 6 months of that year in my van with my partner, and then with another couple of friends in their van, traveling Europe and visiting mostly climbing destinations, but also lots of hiking and via ferratas and swimming. And it was a really exciting way to see lots of other places. And then for the other half of that year, I came back to the UK and I just spent the time traveling from place to place where different friends and family live, or I might not have seen for a while, taking the van and staying with different people, and really paying attention to where I come from and what's important to me around me. And that's something I never would have thought to do if I hadn't been involved in climbing. That I wanted to talk a bit about how to adapt climbing to meet different needs as well. There are some difficulties that I had as a result of dyspraxia, and I had to work with lots of people to work out the best way to manage that myself. So, as I explained earlier, difficulty building muscle tone has been a big issue for me. And I think that in the end, the best way to manage that was to compensate a little bit by really using the power of my legs to help me get through moves rather than pulling out really hard with my arms, and to kind of find different ways of approaching a route so that I don't need loads of upper body strength to do it. Like finding static ways to do moves rather than big, powerful, dynamic moves. I found poor coordination would be the one thing that I would expect even non-dyspraxic people to maybe anticipate that we would struggle with. Basically, you want your hand to go somewhere and your hand doesn't go there. You want your foot to go somewhere and it lands somewhere completely different, or you try and launch your whole body in one direction and you just fall off. And I think, unfortunately, there's no magic solution to this. It's just lots of practice and being able to make fun of yourself. But I do think that over lots of time, my coordination has improved a little bit, and I really enjoy the challenge anyway. Something that I've really found that able-bodied friends and outdoor instructors don't understand is the dangers of being clumsy on the approach or when you're arriving at the crag. So a slightly morbid statistic is that lots more people die on the approach to a crag than they do actually climbing outdoors, because oftentimes things that you can climb are located along sort of really winding paths, often with big drops sort of into the sea, or off a knife edge ridge or something like that. There can be slippery rocks, there can be different hazards kind of crossing your path, there can be low trees. There's lots of things that some people can just sort of brush past as part of their day, but for us, it requires really lots of concentration and it can result in getting into quite difficult situations. So I suppose the most important thing that I had to learn was how to be assertive. And actually, if I'm planning a trip with somebody and they're saying, oh, but I really want to do a route that's at this crag where you have to walk along a path where there's only room for one person at a time, when you have to turn sideways and there's a sheer drop, I had to be able to say, I'm sorry, but that's really not going to be safe for me. And there are plenty of other good climbs at this other crag that's got a safer approach. I had to really learn how to assert myself. And actually, most people are understanding if you explain. And if they're not good climbing partners. I have also found that over time, my ability to manage these difficult approaches has improved a little bit. And that's just with lots of practice. And it doesn't have to be just practice in dangerous contexts. So when I started climbing, I also started going on more trips, doing things like hiking and low-level mountaineering and sort of walking on unsteady ground or wet ground or slippery things or, narrow paths in contexts where there isn't a big sheer drop. So you really do get to practice in places where if you slip over, it's not a big problem. And through over a lot of years doing more and more movement in different outdoor spaces, I have managed to become a little bit more confident on my approaches. Another thing that's very hard to explain to non-disabled people is how hard it can be to land a fall safely. As they say, it's not the fall that kills you, it's the landing. And how bad an issue that is depends a lot on the type of climbing that you're doing. So with top rope climbing, where most people start, you're tied to a rope and the rope is above you, and somebody's pulling down on the other end of that rope so that it always holds you up. So you can't fall the wrong way, you can't hit the ground. The rope is taken in as you go. But with other kinds of climbing, falling can be a bit more dangerous. So another type of roped climbing is lead climbing, where you tie a rope to your harness and then you take that rope up from the ground with you and you clip it into different bits of equipment as you go up. So a lot of the time the rope is below you, and that means that if you fell off, you would fall to just past the previous bit of equipment that you clipped into. So without getting too much into technicalities, it's a bigger fall. Then there's also bouldering, which I suppose is what lots of people might have tried before, where there's no ropes involved, you're just climbing up a short distance and you're climbing off a softer mat so that if you fall down, you're not going to hopefully have any serious injuries. But it doesn't reduce the risk of injury completely. And in order to boulder safely, you do sort of need to be able to control the way that you land. And that's really hard for us. So one of my most severe injuries climbing has just been falling from maybe 2 meters up on a bouldering wall, but landing awkwardly on my back in a way that most people would have been able to twist around and land a bit differently. Then with lead climbing, you might fall a bit harder and just hit the wall at a really awkward angle. I hurt an ankle once doing this, whereas most able-bodied people are just able to swing down, bounce up with their feet, and then climb back up. So I'm making this sound really scary. It's not the worst thing in the world. What I've actually found is the best way to manage it is I do lead climb and I do boulder, but I don't climb at my limits with these forms of climbing because I know that it puts me at a higher risk of injury. So if I want to do something that's the hardest move I've ever done, I'll do it on a top rope and I'll do lead climbing and bouldering for easier routes. And then over time, as my top roping gets better, I can lead and boulder more things because I know that I'm not going to fall off them. And that's sort of the way that I manage it. But I have also done some specialist training, like I joined Paraclimbing London, which is a disability climbing group, and we had a seminar just for people to practice safe ways of falling from bouldering balls. So that was some people with dyspraxia, some people with cerebral palsy, some people with hypermobility where they're at risk of dislocation when they land. And that sort of problem solving with other people who really get it was really helpful for me. So I couldn't learn to do those things on my own. Some of them are problem solving that I've done myself, and I think dyspraxics are usually good problem solvers. But I also joined a couple of different now groups that are for people climbing with disabilities. And even when I was starting out in climbing, and for the first maybe 3 or 4 years, not very much like this existed. But I happened to live in London when Paraclimbing London was formed, and I went along because I'm becoming more and more frustrated with climbing with just able-bodied people. So I think I mentioned a little bit earlier how frustrating it can be if you start with beginners and then everybody else progresses and you don't. And although in climbing you can still climb together, you still end up feeling a little bit left out. And I was getting frustrated about people on trips not understanding my needs. And I was getting frustrated with the fact that no matter how much training I did, I couldn't do a pull-up and I couldn't find people that understood my specific needs and challenges. And I hesitated before going to a paraclimbing group because I did think, And I think a lot of dyspraxic people think this. Am I the right kind of disabled? I think that we can fall in a crack where we feel not normal enough for mainstream sports, but not disabled enough for parasports. But actually, when I went down and met the other people there, it couldn't have been further from the truth. Everybody has been very welcoming and very accepting of people with all different kinds of condition. And I found it really nice to be able to climb with other people who might need to take more rests, and other people who might not be able to climb really high without a top rope, and other people who might progress at different rates. It felt really validating. Um, and it was just nice to make some friends who really understood what it's like to try movement as someone with a disability. So the roles that I now hold are I manage online communications for Paraclimbing London, and I'm a trustee for the UK Paraclimbing Collective charity, which they do some similar things. They both hold lots of meetups for different people with different disabilities. Neither of them would discriminate based on what kind of disability you have or ask for any proof or evidence. They're both just places for disabled climbers to come together. UK Paraclimbing Collective has different branches around England, and Paraclimbing London at the moment is still just based in London. I wasn't sure if I wanted to mention competitive paraclimbing because honestly, I'm not the expert. I don't really climb at a competitive level, but I wanted to discuss what it looks like a little bit. So, the sort of big paraclimbing events in the UK are the British Mountaineering Council's National Series, and that's usually 4 events held throughout the year in different parts of the UK. So we've had Sheffield, Edinburgh, Cardiff. There's usually one in London. I'm really hoping that one is going to come to the competition wall at Warwick University, just because that would be convenient for me, but watch this space. Anyway, those national events usually act as a selection event for the British paraclimbing team. And people with dyspraxia aren't eligible to compete in parasport on an international level because it's not kind of the right kind of recognized disability. And that can really contribute to those feelings of invalidation and those feelings of, am I disabled enough, that we can feel when we're entering these spaces. But the British Paraclimbing Series events usually also run an open category. So that's not for people who want to compete internationally, it's just for people who want to come along with other paraclimbers. And that's really anybody that doesn't have a disability that fits into a typical paraclimbing category. So in most parasports, you have some special categories for people with upper limb differences, people with lower limb differences, blind people, and then people with reduced power or range. So it used to be that dyspraxia went into these reduced power and range categories, but now they don't. So you might have seen some articles in the past about a swimmer who was competitive on an international level and then unfortunately wasn't eligible to compete anymore. So that's sort of where we used to sit, and now we don't. So an open category will have anybody in it that doesn't fit into one of those categories. So for me, I've competed with people with learning disabilities, people with autism, people with mental health conditions, deaf people, people with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It can be really a wide range of people. And in some ways, I love that because you get to meet so many different people and share experiences, and it's a really nice community. But on the other hand, as a competitive category, it's not very fair because I've competed with some people who just had upper body strength that I could never compete with, and it doesn't matter how much I would train, I wouldn't be able to climb at that level. And similarly, I've climbed with some people who have even more difficulties than I do with planning and executing a route, with being able to imagine in advance how a climb is going to go, and with sort of different executive function challenges to me that mean that actually I've got a really big advantage, and that's not fair either. So I think that's the difficulty with open categories. Then there's a company called Blockfest, which is a private company who run big bouldering events throughout the UK. So it's usually a series of 4 or 5 events. And they would have a male podium, a female podium, and then and sort of under 16s or under 18 boys and girls podium. And then they also started to run a paraclimbers podium. So because these events are privately run and they're usually at quite small venues, they don't set special paraclimbing routes, but you climb the same routes as everybody else, and then they have separate rankings for paraclimbers. So that's nice that we do get that acknowledgement and recognition. I've also put local competitions with para categories because lots of cities with climbing walls, they will have their own little competitions, and more in the last couple of years, they're starting to include a para category, which is really nice. And it's got the same problem where you're in with lots of people with a wide range of disabilities. Um, so they don't even have categories for sort of limb difference or blind people. It's everybody together. So once I competed and it was just me and a girl with a limb difference. And so it wasn't fair because there were problems that I just was going to be able to do that she wasn't. But it's still really nice to get that acknowledgement and that opportunity to meet other paraclimbers. Blockfest also ran one event a few years ago that was just for paraclimbers. So it was a big climbing gym in London. And it had a category for absolutely everybody because it wasn't a selection event. So it had all your typical categories, plus it had mental health and learning disability and autism. And they weren't selected based on any kind of evidence or international eligibility. So actually, I entered the reduced power and range category there because that's what I identify with. That's where dyspraxia used to sit. And those kinds of inclusive events are really nice, even though they don't lead to any more competitive opportunities. So that was quite a lot of information, but with all that in mind, I did want to say that going to power climbing competitions for me has been much more about connecting with disabled climbers from all over the UK and actually from around the world. Sometimes they do come to our national series, and about celebrating each other's achievements. That has been a much bigger deal than trying to beat other people. So if you are interested and you want to get started in climbing, these are sort of the first steps I would recommend, and I'm really happy for anybody to contact me if they want more advice. So choose what kind of climbing you want to start with. Lots of people start with top rope climbing because, as I've sort of explained, you're very well protected doing that. You can't fall a long way. So it's a really good way to get a good idea of what your abilities are, what kind of climbs you're easily able to do. And then if you want to move into bouldering, then you can do that with a bit more confidence. However, to get started in top roping, you do also need to learn some rope work. So there is at least one knot that you need to be able to do, and you need to understand how belaying works. So some disabled people prefer to start with bouldering and just kind of take it easy to begin with, because then you can actually just turn up, do a safety introduction and try climbing. There's no kind of complicated skill that you have to learn there. If you're going to go climbing not with other people that you know who know how to climb, I would definitely recommend doing a beginner course. So any climbing wall would have one. You can just find the local wall that's got the type of climbing you want to do and ask them about a beginner course. And you can do these one-to-one or you can do them in a group, depending on what you prefer. And then you're sort of ready to go, really. And if you want to meet more climbers, if you want to meet disabled climbers, you can go online and find sort of paraclimbing groups, and then you might be able to meet other people in your area. But in big cities, local Facebook groups will almost always have an option to post saying, "Oh, does anyone want to go climbing?" And you'll usually find someone if it's somewhere like Bristol, London, Liverpool. Um, but if not, most walls will run a social evening at least once a week and sometimes every day where they say, "Oh, if you turn up between 7 and 9 or whatever, then we'll find someone else and pair you up with them." Or at bouldering walls, quite often everybody goes around in a group and climbs together. If you're a woman or a non-binary person, quite often there are special evenings just for these people so that you can climb in an environment that you feel safe in, so that you can meet other people with the same gender identity as you who are climbing. And that can be really nice as well. So there's lots of ways to meet people and then kind of get involved in climbing in more different settings with them. If you want any help finding paraclimbing groups in your area, again, let me know. I can always help with that. So I wanted to close by circling back to what movement is actually about, how I feel now and what I've learned in the last few years. And I wanted to do this because it applies to whatever kind of movement you want to do. So climbing might not be the thing for you, but if you're still thinking, what's my sport going to be? Don't look for something because it will make you feel thinner. Don't look for something because it will make you look really impressive. Look for something that will make you enjoy using your body. And I want the focus to be not on the way that you look, but the way that you feel. And I want you to have those moments where you go, wow, like I can't believe that my brain is doing that. Or like, look at my legs carrying me in this amazing situation. That's how movement should feel. It should be about having new experiences. And I think that that's sort of a contentious thing to say almost, because when I look for new experiences, I'm like, oh yeah, through movement, I've been able to go in mountains and attach myself to sheer faces and jump in lakes and, snow slopes and all of this kind of thing. But actually, that could be a new experience that you want to have. Or a new experience for you could be going to a Zumba class and trying moving to music and enjoying the interesting lights that they have there. Um, or it could be trying cold water swimming and just experiencing those different sensations. Or it could be going to a roller disco, although you might break a neck. But whatever it is, trying something that feels different to something that you've done before, I think is what I love about movement the most. I think it's about sharing challenges and success with other people. So, where I put before that it was about connecting with my family, movement is still about connecting with my family, and I love to go climbing with them, but that can apply to your friends, or it can apply to people that you met at the climbing wall, or it can apply to connecting with other disabled people if you want to. You don't have to. Like I say, not everybody identifies strongly in that way. Um, and I think it's about connecting with the world around you. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean immersing yourself in glacier water or whatever. Connecting with the world around you could just be having a walk around your local park and thinking like, oh wow, don't the birds sound nice today? I think the movement should be much more about that than it is about going, oh, what are the physical limits that I can push myself to, if that makes any sense. I think it's about trial and error and trying lots of different kinds of movement and thinking about what works for you. But the metric for what works for you shouldn't be what have I improved my time at the fastest or what have I lost the most weight doing. But it should be what makes you feel good and what you look forward to doing. So if you do have any questions, I would like to have done a Q&A, but obviously I haven't got the opportunity. But do feel free to follow me on social media and send me a message or drop me an email. The address at the bottom is for UK Paraclimbing Collective, so that's the charity that I'm a trustee for. And the reason I put it there is just because their website has a directory of different organisations that are useful for disability climbing. So some of them are paraclimbing clubs, like the ones that I belong to. Some of them are outdoor instructors that we know are kind of friendly and accessible for disabled people. Some of them are residential centres that can facilitate access for people with different disabilities. So that's a really good resource if you specifically wanted to connect with disability climbing groups. But please feel free to send me a message personally if you're just not sure about where to start with getting into climbing. And outside of that, hopefully I'll see you at the crag one day.